CBT Nuggets JNCIS Security Series Firewall User Authentication. Well, we've discovered so far through several nuggets of this series that a firewall is more than just a device that keeps a fire from spreading from one zone or one domain to another. A firewall can also be like a security guard, let's say at a border crossing, to keep one particular user out of another domain or allowing certain users into other domains. So our gateway can be also a authentication firewall or a user authentication device, forcing users to provide credentials to be authenticated to initiate connections across the firewall from, let's say, the untrust zone to the trust zone, or the untrust zone to the DMZ zone. So as Junos administrators, we can restrict and permit users, including administrative users, to access protected resources behind the firewall and base it on their source IP address and other credentials. Let's talk about this feature in this nugget. I like to think of a user authentication feature on a firewall as like the bouncer at a very exclusive Hollywood club, for example. Now, there is a difference here. The way we're looking at it is the security guard, which is actually the bouncer who is the firewall, has a VIP list. And only if you're on the VIP list and you provide the proper credentials, for example, a passport or a driver's license, or they recognize you, will you be allowed in. Now, we also know that in a real world environment, usually people wait in line because as there are openings, people leave the club, somebody gets to go in because there's only a certain capacity. That's not what we're talking about here. These people waiting in line are actually waiting for somebody on the inside, an administrative user, for example, somebody who's in charge, to allow them to come in. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. And there's really a case-by-case basis is how we really approach this. I don't look at this personally as a long-term solution for, let's say, remote access or remote site users. We're going to really rely upon virtual private networking for those types of features. And beyond IPsec, as you get beyond this course and you get into the next level of JNCIS, of Junos security, you'll look at more robust features like SSL VPN, for example. So I like to look at VPN as really the best case scenario, but this is what we would call an ad hoc solution to let users, let's say, on the inside trusted zone, maybe they're guests, maybe they're people that are just at our office for a few days, they're inside our trusted network. We want to open up holes in the firewall to let them surf the web or let them connect to other extranet partners on a case-by-case basis. Or we have, let's say, administrators or teleworkers, maybe somebody who's on administrative leave, or maybe it's a female CIO who's on maternity leave. And we want to open a hole in the firewall to allow them to provide some credentials and they get access to resources in the DMZ or in the inside of our zone. So we kind of look at this as a ad hoc solution, not so much a long-term solution. Okay? And keep in mind that the Junos also supports administrator user types and PPP, point-to-point protocol user types as well. Now, let's look at the two main schemes. There's two authentication schemes you have available to get through this really tough-looking bouncer here. Now, the first type I want to talk about is pass-through authentication. And by the way, this can be for a wide variety of scenarios. The source of the packet could be, let's say, in the untrust zone, and then the destination server could be in the DMZ zone or the trust zone. Or the source could be in the trust zone and the destination could be in the DMZ zone. For example, this particular user wants to upload content on a case-by-case basis, upload web pages, upload FTP files, things like that. So there's a wide variety of applications here that we can do this. I like using this especially for that pass-through to upload content on DMZ servers. So as we can see, we have our SRX here, which is our pass-through authentication proxy. And by the way, Cisco actually calls this feature authentication proxy or user auth. So this is a feature that's also available on Cisco devices as well, so it's not uncommon. So we've got our host or our user from one zone. needing to access resources, either getting things or uploading things in another zone. Okay, gave you some scenarios. Now here's the deal. You can see that credentials are going to be provided here. Okay, so there's kind of a policy engine working here on behalf of the SRX. So it's asking for credentials, and there's only three ways that you can authenticate: FTP, Telnet, or HTTP. In other words, you can have an FTP window in a console or in a CLI of some type, a Telnet window, or it can be an HTTP page, which is a real basic page generated by the SRX that asks for a username and password. These are the only three ways that the client can use to be authenticated. Now, that doesn't mean that once they're authenticated and they get access to the server that they can't do other things, right? They can do other things, but this is the initial authentication mechanism. Let me give you a real-world example. I used to, before I got a bunch of equipment of my own, in my own rack, I used to go up to an organization called GigaVelocity, which is a great place. They got tons of racks of gear. So I used to go up there and I would log on to their equipment. But I was initially prompted with a Telnet prompt where I would put in my username and password. Once I was actually able to be authenticated, I was passed through into the particular rack of equipment and servers, and then I could do all kind of things. Okay, so and it was basically, instead of using an SRX, it was using a Cisco router or an access server, but it's the same concept, right? It's the SRX, however, that's intercepting the requests, and then it's going to prompt the user, okay, for information. Now, the matching credentials, in order to get a success message, have to be stored somewhere. And there's two options with pass-through authentication. They can be stored on the local database of the SRX, which is not very scalable. It's also only a solution you would use in a branch or a remote office small business solution. Or the preferred method is the external authorization server, the external authentication server. For example, a Radius server. And this is, a prime candidate for the Radius protocol, or its successor to soon to be Diameter. Okay. Now, the advantages of using an external authentication server are really huge, and it's beyond the scope of this particular course. But remember, if this particular user or device wanted to authenticate against a bunch of different devices or pass through multiple different areas of a campus, for example, then having all these separate local databases is kind of cumbersome and hard to manage. So the advantage of an external authentication server is if you need to have pass-through authentication on a lot of appliances between different devices in different zones, and if you have quite a few of these kind of ad hoc connections that have to take place, either between the trusted zone and the DMZ, or the untrust zone and the trust zone, or the untrust zone and the DMZ. Or there's other zones as well. You could have extranet zones, you could have e-commerce zones. It just depends on your organization. You may have management VLAN zones. Okay, if you have a management VLAN in its own zone, this would be a pretty good feature to use if you were somebody moving across the campus, for example, and you were, on somebody's machine, like you were doing troubleshooting on an end user machine, and you suddenly needed some ad hoc access through a firewall to get to a particular server or host in the management VLAN or the management zone. That could be very practical. Okay, so that's pass-through authentication. The important thing to remember here is that there is a policy lookup in the policy engine. And so if we look at the flow of processing, this is going to kind of come into play there. Also remember this. This authentication is allowing this source IP address. So there is no real extended user authentication. So once this authentication proxy is allowed, okay, and this traffic is permitted, then basically any user on this source host could get on there and access resources, right? So what you could do is you could have on the external authentication server, for example, you could have like pretty short timeouts and you could re-authenticate, for example, if you want to do it that way. Now this is not a convenient solution. Okay, let me just tell you that. So you want to look at this as a situation, an ad hoc situation, where suddenly security takes the front seat, okay, or convenience takes the back seat. And for Tracy Smith here, who is, let's say, a consultant or an auditor, or she's a third party partner that comes into the organization, we need to provide a higher security environment for her as she gets access between zones on the SRX. Okay, that's why we would do this. If you're going to allow the source on the internet or the untrusted zone to pass through the SRX to the DMZ, be very careful. Okay, be very careful. Like I said, in that scenario, I really like to go with a VPN solution, but that's just where I stand. Now that's the first type of pass-through authentication. The second type is called web authentication. But here's how I want to approach this particular nugget. Let's go ahead and configure a scenario for pass-through authentication. Let me show you the configuration there, and then we'll go look at our second feature, web authentication. Okay, because I don't want to do the two configurations back to back. Let's just stick with one strategy right now. Let's take a look at a pass-through authentication configuration. Okay, since I've put you through, I don't know, 15 nuggets so far in this series of having to watch me type, excruciatingly slowly into the console, let's just go through the syntax here real quickly. It's nothing you haven't seen before, so it's just basically a policy. So we're going to be putting Gigi000 will be in the untrusted zone. Gigi001 will be in the trust zone. So we assign this address to 0. We assign this address to 1. So we'll have some host out here either on this same network or routed that will be our packet source, right? It'll be the one that will be passed through authenticated. So we'll set an access profile. That's something new, okay? An access profile, we're going to call it FW auth, and then we're going to say the client is FW client 1. That's the name of the client. And then the firewall user keyword, we're saying their password is, and this is the password, okay, JuniPass. Then we're going to set the access firewall authentication, pass-through, and we'll say default profile, we'll call this, again, we see it's fauth. So default profile means we're going to use this profile, right? Then we'll set access firewall authentication, pass-through. We know that this is not our only option. We'll find out in a minute. And then we're going to use Telnet to authenticate them. And when we do, we want to present them with a banner, if they're successful, that says, "Welcome to Juniper Telnet session." Nice. Okay, so here's our zones. Set security zones, untrust. We're going to go ahead and do the system services all. And then set security zone untrust. Interfaces, as I said, 0.0. Host inbound traffic protocols all. So pretty much wide open there. Then we'll set security zone trust. Okay. We'll say system services all, and we'll say protocols all, and that is on Gigi001.0, which is on the trust zone. Then we've got a couple of set security policies from zone to trust zone. Okay. Policy, we'll call it policy 1, and we're going to match any source address, and we're going to match any destination address. Obviously, using address books would be a more granular, reducing our attack surface. Then we will say set security policies from to zone trust. Again, so this is all being authenticated from the untrust zone to the trust zone, and we're matching application Juno's telnet. Okay, so that's definitely pretty specific. And then we're going to set our security policies from untrust to trust. Policy 1. Here's our action, permit. And then here's the really important keyword for the exam, especially firewall-authentication, pass-through, and then client match. And what's the client? FW client 1 up here. So they'll have to enter their password, JuniPass, with a telnet prompt, then they can get access. Let's go ahead and take a look at this configuration, how we would do this in the JWeb. So I'll log in as mshannon, password Nugget Lab. Okay, we want to go to the configure area and go to access, create an access profile. And so we'll add, I think we called this FW auth, correct? And then local database. We'll add a user. I think we said the user was going to be FW client 1. Their password was Junipass, and then we can put an IP address in here if we want to. Don't have to do that, but I can hard code it in there if I want. Click on OK. I could add more, obviously. FW client 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now go to FW authentication, and here we can see some path-through settings. So we'll choose FW auth as our profile, and here we can see we did set up a banner, okay, for Telnet. We said we gave it a success banner, right? We said, you know, welcome to Juniper Firewall. I think it was user authentication. I don't know what it was. I forgot now. Or, you know, pass-through authentication. How's that? So they really know what they're doing, okay? But you can also have a fail and a login banner. So what they're actually going to see, you know, please provide your credentials. And of course, if we were using HTTP or FTP as our authentication methods, we could have banners there as well. Here's where you would come to do your web auth settings. Okay, really pretty much just a success banner. However, and we won't come back in here, but you know that you can set this up here. You can also, check this out, you can also have a logo image that shows up on the actual very simple web page, a GIF image, okay, of 172 by 65 pixels. Okay, so you can browse and upload that special image you want to have on the login page that they use for web authentication. Okay, so here's where you come to do it in the JWeb. Just thought you might want to look at that. It's very simple. Let's go back now and go ahead and configure. Talk about web authentication and configure, show the configuration of that as well. Now, one of the things about pass-through user authentication that was unique was when the user wanted to pass through, whether they're in the Telnet window or the FTP window or they're in their browser, the IP address or fully qualified name they're going to put in there is the one of the ultimate target. So it was this server, for example. So with pass-through, I wanted to access 30.30.30.2. That was the ultimate server. Here, though, with web authentication, we're going to put in the browser the IP address of the WebAuth service. Okay, so on the SRX, it'll probably be this outside interface or the interface in the untrusted zone, 20.20.20.3. That's what we're going to HTTP to, as opposed to with pass-through. We're actually, remember, with pass-through, the SRX intercepted the connection to the resource that they typed in there. Okay, intercepted this. Here, though, it's going to be actually HTTP to this address. And then, of course, we will cache the result based on our local database or our external authentication server or Radius server. And by the way, what will be presented to the end user here is this kind of default user authentication web auth window. Okay? So basically, the end user, or the auth user, we'll call them, they're going to create a connection to the web auth IP address, okay, 20.20.20.3. Junos will then look, check the user account in its local database, for example, in our example, okay. Then the auth user will initiate a connection, as long as they're successful, to 30.30.30.2. The policy engine here will keep track of the fact that the policy that applies to this traffic must be authenticated via WebAuth. So it checks its list of authenticated users. It sees that the user is currently authenticated using WebAuth, and it'll pass that traffic on to the destination server, web server or SharePoint server at 30.30.30.2. Keep in mind that the web auth address up here has to be in the same subnet as the interface that you want to host it. So for example, if we're hosting on the, let's say gig E000 like we did before, gig E000 in the untrust zone, then it needs to be in a different IP address than the interface, but in the same subnetwork. So for example, we'll say that the gig E000 interface in the untrust zone in the SRX is 20.20.20.1, for example. Now, remember, once we allow this traffic, once we permit this traffic, basically any other user coming from that same address can access this resource. So we have to consider, are we using possibly some other type of extended authentication, maybe something that we're going to do a separate authentication process on this web server, or maybe if this is part of Active Directory, we can have, not a single sign-on scenario, but additional user authentication. This particular technique here, really, Juniper recommends this when the client devices are basically immediately adjacent to the security gateway. And we're pretty sure that these aren't multi-user hosts, but it's a management user, it's administrative user, it's somebody who just needs to upload content or get content from a SharePoint or web server. Let's take a look at the configuration for this. And by the way, we already saw where we can go and add a banner in the JWeb. Okay, let's look at the WebAuth configuration here. We're first going to set our gig E000, which is an untrusted interface, okay, going to the service provider. And the address is 20.20.20.1/24. Then we're going to create our web authentication interface. So web authentication, HTTP, and then we need to make sure it's in the same subnetwork but unused. Okay, so we'll make it .3. This is the address that the user is going to put in their web browser, okay, in the URL that they want to get to, the address bar, right? So then we'll set interface gig E001. We'll say that's either the inside network, or I guess it is the inside of the trust network, okay? So we'll do 001, and this is going to be the address there. So we'll set the access profile, call it WebAuth. The client, this time we'll use FW Client 2, and then firewall user password Junipass. Then we'll set the firewall authentication web authentication this time, okay? And then we'll say the profile is going to be WebAuth. We'll set the access firewall authentication web authentication this time, success banner to WebAuth login success, and we'll go ahead and add a failure banner this time that says WebAuth login failed. Then we'll do our zone configuration. Set security zone untrust. We'll do system services all, and we'll do protocols all as well. You can see it's gig E000.0 on the untrust zone. Then we'll set security zoned trust hostbound traffic, all the system services, and for gig E00, oops, this is not right. That should be 1.0. Let me fix that. Okay, 1.0, all the protocols, and then we'll set security policies from untrust to trust. We'll make it policy 2 this time, matching any source address, and then policy 2 matching any destination address, and then matching any application. And our then statement, okay, from the untrust to the trust zone, policy 2 then statement will be to permit firewall authentication, but of the type web authentication, and then the client's going to match the FW client 2 this time. And then finally, this very important command that's exam worthy, set system services web-management HTTP, and then interface gig E000.0. That's the interface that goes to the untrusted zone, which, as we know, has this IP address assigned to it. However, the web authentication address is 20.20.20.3/24. That's the one the clients will access. All right, in this CBT nugget of the JNCIS Security Series, we learned about a special feature of Junos on the SRX called Firewall User Authentication. We looked at two different types, the pass-through authentication and the web authentication, and looked at configurations for both. I hope this CBT nugget has been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing.